Thank you, Sakurai-san, and good morning to all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, I would submit that the word crisis is overused in international relations, but I also would suggest that for the United States and the nearby nations, including Japan, the reality of a nuke-ready North Korea is clearly a matter of the deepest moment. After decades of steadily violent rhetoric and periodically violent actions, Pyongyang, to the genuine surprise of many, has achieved a capability of carrying out at least some of its dire threats. We therefore are very fortunate this morning to have as our speaker Ambassador Robert Gallucci. He is a professor at Georgetown currently and chairman of the U.S.-Korea Institute of Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. But as you can see from his bio, this comes on top of a long career of academic and official posts. Indeed, perhaps no other living observer and participant has similar breadth of experience in the hard diplomacy of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, and with particular focus on the ongoing engagement with North Korea. He was most notably the chief U.S. negotiator in the 1994 crisis with Pyongyang, then in the dying days of the original dictator Kim Il-sung. That episode, which is generally considered to be the most serious modern brush that the United States has had with Pyongyang, is, to this day, considered by some reflective of the challenge that the United States faces today. I think Ambassador Gallucci will spend the bulk of his time setting the stage of the current crisis and will not therefore be delving too much into the history, although this may come up in our Q&A. But I would suggest one aspect of consideration here, and that is whether our history of engagement, fractious as it's been with North Korea, is in fact something that informs our situation today, or whether, instead, the existence of Kim Jong-un is a different kind of adversary, and whether that means, in fact, that some historical parallels may not apply to the current situation. With that as a backdrop, I can only invite Ambassador Gallucci to the stage and indeed let him describe whether this is, in fact, a crisis of the moment. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It is an honor, and I genuinely mean that, an honor to be here with you this morning at Japan Society. I have been looking forward to it, and I'll be very honest with you right away and tell you that I've been looking forward to it because I want to say something about the current situation, which, as Tim mentioned, is characterized as a nuclear crisis. And some colleagues and I wrote a book whose title was Going Critical, The First North Korean Nuclear Crisis. And I don't know whether the back and forth that we engaged in, I won't say enjoyed, during the 2000s, during the Bush administration, counted or counts as another crisis, or whether this is the second North Korean nuclear crisis. But I want to focus on that, actually, in a way to frame the current situation just a little bit differently than the way I think it is being framed most frequently, and most importantly by the Trump administration. I don't think that the United States of America has manufactured a nuclear crisis with North Korea. But I do think that the United States defines this nuclear crisis of 2017 and defines the solution space. It is not the current situation, the crisis, if you will. It is not the result of pre-existing conditions, to take a phrase from the healthcare policy debate. There isn't, interestingly, when you think about this, I don't know how many of you in the audience are international relations scholars or have had a brush with IR theory, as we call it, but there's none of the usual pre-existing conditions really help explain the current confrontation between the DPRK and the USA. There's no territorial issue. There's no status of Jerusalem, return of the refugees, and a line to be drawn on the West Bank. There's no Kashmir, like between India and Pakistan. There's no religious issue between the United States and North Korea, when one group is not Sunni and the other Shia, not Hindu Pakistan. I would say it's not even a conflict with a pre-existing condition of different systems, like the United States and the Soviet Union for all those decades of the Cold War. You may say, in response, that, wait a minute, it is different systems, the United States and North Korea. Command economy, totalitarian democracy. Yeah, I get that. But that's not what we have been saying is the issue. As a matter of fact, the Secretary of State went out of his way, I think usefully, to say that this is not about Kim Jong-un's regime. We don't have requirements with respect to how the DPRK treats its own people, the human rights issue. Maybe we should, but right now we're prepared to put those aside. It's not even, I would say to you, if you're thinking, well, it is a pre-existing condition, it's nuclear weapons. Well, hold on a minute. Those nuclear weapons have been around for some time. 2005, the first test. Between 2005 and 2016, 5 tests, not counting the 6th last month. So we've tolerated and put up with not only fissile material production, plutonium, almost certainly also highly enriched uranium, but also the manufacture and testing of nuclear weapons, and never called it a crisis. Well, what about ballistic missiles? Well, we've lived with the ballistic missiles too. The MRBMs go back decades. IRBMs, not quite so much, but maybe 15 years. So it isn't pre-existing conditions. And I would also say it's not even the vulnerability of our allies, Japan and the Republic of Korea, to North Korean ballistic missiles, perhaps being mated with nuclear weapons. We have maintained continually, because they have been vulnerable for all these years, we have maintained the adequacy, the credibility of the American extended deterrent. So, what's new? Why do we have a crisis? The United States has defined this as a crisis because North Korea is approaching a new capability. It's a new capability for North Korea. It's not a new condition for the United States, but it's a new capability for North Korea. And you all know what it is. It is the development of a missile, ballistic missile with the range of an intercontinental ballistic missile, being mated with a nuclear weapon, and perhaps we want to say, subsequent to the last test, a thermonuclear weapon. And if I just digress a moment here, that's non-trivial. If it is a thermonuclear weapon, we're talking, instead of a weapon that might be somewhat larger than the weapons used by the United States against Japan to end the Second World War, we'd be talking about weapons 10 or more times larger than that, a non-trivial distinction, making the United States territorial, continental United States, CONUS as we say, vulnerable in a way it had not been vulnerable. We, the United States of America, where I'm arguing defining this crisis, unsatisfied with deterrence as a method of achieving our security. That's the new thing. If we want to make this look not quite so bad about the American-centric view here, we could say, perhaps, that as America becomes vulnerable to North Korean ballistic missiles, it stresses the credibility of our extended deterrent to our allies, and that would be new also. But this is really new for North Korea. We have had more than 60 years of this kind of vulnerability to the Soviet Union and Russia. I calculate more than 30 years of this kind of vulnerability to China, with no capability, I put that, no capability really, to defend as in deny, through the use of a ballistic missile defense system, deny access to those missiles to U.S. territory. We did not have it in the 1950s, and we do not have it now. And if anybody in question time wants to press me on that, I'd be happy to engage them on American capability to, with any kind of confidence, intercept incoming ICBM warheads. But to go back to the main point here, this vulnerability that we have, one could argue, changes the calculation of extended deterrence. But please remember, as I talk about American vulnerability through all those years, that stressed the American extended deterrent to our allies in Europe. And we argued for decades that the Europeans could rely on the United States, sometimes somewhat frivolously called a nuclear umbrella, notwithstanding our vulnerability to the Soviet Union's ICBMs, and similarly, ultimately, China's capability for those in Asia who were allied with us and for whom we extended deterrent, to the Chinese capability to reach the continental United States. So, first point, we are defining this situation. It is fundamentally, analytically, nothing new. We have also done some interesting calculations and drawn some interesting conclusions about what the solution space is here. I'm not exactly sure how to properly use the phrase solution space, but I've always liked it, and I'm going to use it now and hope it applies. What I really mean here is the set of things or policies or postures we might take to deal with the crisis as we are, and I'm arguing, defining it. The first is that among the things not in the solution space as we define it is negotiation as a method of resolving the crisis. Now, I recognize this administration speaks with more than one voice, and these voices say different things over time, and one could have a hard time proving what authoritatively is the American position with respect to negotiating an outcome to a confrontation with North Korea. But I would say overall, what is being projected by the administration, and the president should be the first one looks to understand what is the American position, is that to negotiate, attempt to negotiate with North Korea now, in the face of these threats, is to buckle, to concede to an effort to blackmail. It would be an act of appeasement used in a negative sense. Some of my colleagues think appeasement has gotten a bad name over the years, but generally speaking, it is pejorative and negative, and appeasement is not good. It is regarded and has explicitly been labeled, not only by the president, but others around him, as a failed policy. It has been observed that North Korea cheats and cheated on the deal made in 1994, known as the Agreed Framework, can be expected to cheat again, and most recently, making the enterprise of seeking negotiations a waste of time. So negotiations are being taken out of the solution space, the legitimate solution space. Second, the military option, which is, as we say, always on the table, has very often, in comments made by administrative officials, been taken off the table effectively. There is, we are told, no good military option. The use of military force, kinetic force as they call it, is unappealing. Seoul is literally, the city of Seoul, the city of someplace between 12 and 20 million people, is a hostage to North Korean artillery, conventional force. And Seoul and Tokyo combined are hostages to North Korean nuclear weapons delivered by ballistic missiles. So the military option is out of the solution space. What about the all-purpose default option, embraced rather too aggressively, some think, by the Obama administration, sometimes called containment, most recently called strategic patience? Well, that's been removed from the solution space as simply not working. Containment doesn't contain the problem which we claim needs to be addressed in this nuclear crisis. We contain, they build and test. North Korea will achieve the ICBM nuclear weapons capability that we want it not to have, containment notwithstanding. So that's gone from the solution space. What's left? What's left and is being embraced aggressively and enthusiastically with a bewildering, from my perspective, optimism, is sanctions enhanced by China's active participation. That's what we have now. This is how I would frame this situation. What is wrong, I would ask you, with this picture? First, I'd start with, it's not clear to me, not terribly important, so I'd say, it's not clear, it shouldn't be absolutely clear, that we need to have a nuclear crisis right now. I'd make 5 points in this connection. First, the military balance between the United States, just the United States, and North Korea would be captured by the phrase extreme asymmetry in both conventional and nuclear forces. An asymmetry which strongly, overwhelmingly, incredibly favors the United States of America. It's not that we don't have any credible military options. The North Koreans have no credible military option. They cannot credibly, the way a strategist would look at this, they cannot credibly threaten Japan, the Republic of Korea, and certainly not the United States of America, and they won't be able to, perhaps ever. This doesn't all change when they do mate a thermonuclear weapon with an ICBM. It doesn't change. There's language used by the strategists to capture this in terms of deterrence theory, of first strike and second strike and survivability. There's a lot that goes into the characterization of a conventional military balance. North Korea fails on all these tests. Yes, though, North Korea is plausibly credible in using nuclear weapons to prevent ultimate regime change. Survival of the regime may be the one case where the North Koreans might elect suicide because they would be choosing between two kinds of suicide, or the decision maker might see it that way. So yes, that would be true, and the argument, which we have heard from others, that we want to have nuclear weapons to prevent anyone from trying to change our regime, there is something to that. I mean, one can, if your mind is already going to, well, how does this apply to other cases? Can I test this analytical calculation that he's presenting this morning for Iran? Yes, it would look somewhat similar to what I'm saying now, with the same yes, but what are nuclear weapons good for? A question the United States used to ask frequently when we were developing various missions for our nuclear weapons, tactical and strategic. Well, one is the survival of the regime. You become credible at that point, threatening first use. But I don't believe, apart from that, North Korea, with this leader, the previous ones, is suicidal. Not more suicidal than the Soviet Union under Khrushchev and others. Not more suicidal than China under Mao and others. The U.S. does have credible military options, and it can deter North Korea from holding Seoul, Tokyo, or Washington hostage in dictating outcomes. Second point, negotiations. Negotiations can fail. Agreements can be bad agreements from the perspective of one side or the other or both. They are, I would say a good way to sum up, they are only as good or bad as the negotiators make them, and then the states agree. The agreed framework, I know Tim said I wasn't going to talk about this, but one sentence, the agreed framework, for whatever one may say about it, is implicated in, or actually stopped, plutonium production in North Korea for a decade. The calculation I got, and we got, from the intelligence community in the early mid-90s was that unless the North Korean plans to complete the additional graphite-moderated reactors were stopped, a new president in 2000, elected in 2000, 2001, would find North Korea with around 100 nuclear weapons, quite plausibly. The new president, who had not much enthusiasm for the agreement, found in North Korea without any nuclear weapons in 2001. And I think that's because the agreement did some good, and a non-trivial amount of good. The Iran deal, which the president has not shown any enthusiasm for, I would argue still looks a lot better than the alternatives to the Iran deal, which should be the test, not whether one could imagine a deal which is more to our liking. I could imagine a better deal with North Korea than the one we struck in 1994. That's not the test. Is it better than not having a deal? Is the test. Negotiations are a tool, like military options. There is no reason not to explore the use of negotiations as a method of resolving the disagreement, even the crisis, between the United States and the DPRK. 3, containment. I would argue containment remains a reasonable default option requiring constant alliance cultivation to be effective. What I'm saying here is that if we don't use military force and we don't succeed in getting a negotiation and getting a negotiated outcome to the current disagreements between the United States, the ROK, and others, and the DPRK, continuing containment is an acceptable outcome. It does require a little more discipline about defense, and particularly about deterrence. Defense, as you must know, relies on capabilities which can be tested. Deterrence, when it's successful, does not. deterrence is a psychological concept. For the theorist of deterrence, deterrence is pure punishment after the act. Right? A theorist wouldn't say, I'm deploying some sort of defense and I'll gain some deterrence. No, deterrence is offensive, it's punishment. Keep these two things separate, it helps. You never know when deterrence is working. You certainly know when it fails. And you don't help this psychological mechanism by disparaging your allies. You keep that alliance front and center. The mutual security treaty with Japan, the bilateral alliance with the Republic of Korea are essential, particularly if you have a containment policy, because you're not impacting North Korean thinking by other means. Fourth, sanctions. Even sanctions that are enhanced by China's enthusiastic and active participation will probably, I think, probably not bring North Korea to its knees or stop its ballistic missile and nuclear weapons programs. I don't have a problem with the administration's enthusiasm for sanctions, its effort at encouraging China to be more cooperative in enforcing the sanctions. I would say, and this is way too flip, but it's early this morning, knock yourself out. But don't count on sanctions saving the day with China leading the way. Maybe it'll happen, it hasn't happened yet. Fifth, we should consider what North Korea wants as well as what we want, and see what we see when we do that with respect to that solution space, particularly with respect to negotiations. What does North Korea want? Well, it starts in the discussions. I wouldn't say negotiations, but I do occasionally these track 1.5, track 2s with North Koreans, and they start the discussion with, we need to do something about your ability and enthusiasm, you the Americans, for regime change. We will not be Iraq. We will not be Libya. We will be a nuclear weapon state. You will not be able to do that to us. So, what do they want? They want, first, an end to what they call hostile policy of the United States, which has a number of components. They want a normal or normalization of relations. They want a normal relation with the United States of America so that regime change is not on our agenda. They want an end to the things that they regard as a manifestation of hostile policy, of aggression, of not having a normal relationship. That includes particularly the aggressive parts of our military exercises with the ROK. They have told me that they are not amused by exercises which are labeled decapitation practice. They have told us they do not like strategic nuclear bombers, never mind the B-1s don't carry nuclear weapons. They also know that. But strategic bombers flying over the Korean Peninsula, meant to be threatening. They want an end, and this is cultural, to insults to their leader, to Kim Jong-un. They want a peace treaty to replace the armistice. They want an end to sanctions in the international community. And they want to be accepted as a nuclear weapons state. I mean, you could say sort of like India, if you wanted to be unkind. They perhaps also want to reunify the peninsula under a government headquartered in Pyongyang. Whether they want, short of that, the United States forces removed from the Korean Peninsula changes over time. At one point in the negotiations many years ago, over 20 years ago, my opposite number, Deputy Foreign Minister Kang Suk-ju, said in a sidebar conversation with only my and his interpreter president, if we succeed at this negotiation, we will no longer require that American forces leave the Korean Peninsula. We will want you to stay. That was, some of you may remember, something that the South Korean president, when he visited North Korea, reported back that he had heard as well. Their view of the United States and its presence depends on how the normalization process goes. So some of this, I think we could concede, accept treaty and other things, and some we obviously can't, reunification under the DPRK. But, and I'm going to close on this point, a nuclear weapons-free Korean Peninsula, I believe, is plausible, not immediately, but after negotiations, after a process of normalization that succeeds as opposed to the one in the 90s which did not, and after some evolution of the North Korean regime. I'm perfectly prepared to focus on security as we did in 1994, but I don't think that's a plausible long-term strategy if the only outcome that really leads to a stable, peaceful relationship is normalization. That's not going to be achieved while the North Koreans treat their people the way they do. The United States will not have a normal relationship. They do not have to meet the standards of a Jeffersonian democracy. We have relations with any number of countries who have rather interesting views of what proper human rights amount to in a nation state, and they don't comport with ours, but we still have good relations. That is possible. So I mean some sort of evolution here, which we've seen some of, interestingly. The North Koreans have responded to some of what the United Nations has asked of a country to have proper human rights standards. So I say over time, I think it's possible to get to a situation in which there are no nuclear weapons programs on the Korean Peninsula. Notice, I didn't say no nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. No nuclear weapons programs. I've done nuclear inspection. It's going to be very hard to say I've checked under every bed and in every box, and there are no remaining nuclear weapons. But it's not hard to gain the transparency, be able to monitor, and ultimately verify an agreement that says there's no nuclear weapons program and no nuclear weapons we know of in North Korea. That we can do, and we've done elsewhere. And I don't think, finally, it is prudent or smart to say North Korea will never give up its nuclear weapons. I know they say that, but not everything, thank goodness, the North Koreans say comes true. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, for that. We're going to converse for a bit and then move along to your questions in short order here. If I can characterize your remarks, I think your message to us was that this is deadly serious and something to be tackled with all intellectual might, but that we ought to not get our knickers in a knot over this as the United States. Is that fair?
Yeah, I suppose that's a part of the tone I wanted to strike this morning, and that I would like to see my government take. I'd like us to act like the power that we are.
If the strategic imbalance is such that you suggest, with the United States in a dominant position as far as the eye can see over North Korea, why then were the engagements going back to 1994, and let's revisit that for a moment. This was a situation in which the enrichment was going on and the inspectors had been kicked out, and we could pretty much see where that was going to lead things. The agreed framework proceeded from that, and as you suggest, held off a lot of that activity for a decade or so. But if from that point forward through certainly as late as 2012, when the Obama administration sought to obtain a freeze on weapons development, hasn't the urgent objective all along been to prevent us from getting to this very spot that we are today, and which you say is not something which we should turn into a crisis when it need not be?
Sorta. But when I look back over the period from, let's say, 1993, when I was the fortunate winner of the lottery and got to meet with the North Koreans, up until let's say, the inauguration of President Trump, we've had a sort of sliding scale on what's acceptable. In 1993, if you remember what caused that crisis, the North Koreans rejected a call by the IAEA to inspect a particular site, which they wanted to have what's called a special inspection, because it was a site not designated by the North Koreans for inspection. And the IAEA typically doesn't go where it's not invited. It's an odd inspection regime, but that's how it works. And then when the leadership at the IAEA, the capable hands of Hans Blix, brought the matter to the board of the IAEA and ultimately reported the matter to the UN Security Council, and North Korea became the subject of a formal reprimand by the president of the council at that time. The North Koreans withdrew from the NPT. And we could see where this was going. And from a political perspective, this wasn't good. So the crisis, you could say, was initially a political crisis brought on by withdrawal from the NPT, which had never happened. Right? Later accessions, but not withdrawals. And from a more military, materials way, we were looking at, and very closely, at least the American intelligence community was, this relatively small gas graphite moderated reactor which was producing plutonium, and we believe they were separating that plutonium in quantities larger than they had acknowledged to the IAEA, and we could see, looking down the road, a nuclear weapons program in North Korea. That this was not a research program, it was not an energy program, power program, it was a weapons program, and we wanted to stop it. So when we went into the negotiations in the spring, May and June of 1993, we wanted both political outcome. We wanted to get them back into the NPT. We wanted them not to execute their withdrawal rights. And we wanted also to stop reprocessing, stop the separation of plutonium. So that was our standard. Now, and we achieved that. The negotiations, they gave up not only the 5 megawatt, but the 50 megawatt and the 200 megawatt reactors that were under construction. They closed down the reprocessing facility. As we say, basta così, done. Okay. Then through the 90s, there's a fair amount of back and forth with Pakistan, which could be easily characterized as cheating by the North Koreans. For the North Koreans, they were hedging against the possibility the United States would not fulfill its obligations as they saw it, not only to deliver these light water reactors, but to normalize relations. In any event, I think President Clinton believes that in June of 1994, had the North Koreans begun to reprocess that fuel, he would have struck the reprocessing plant. For those who don't know, the JCS was directed to prepare to do that. We had looked at what that would look like, calculated all kinds of things. This is a long-winded way, I apologize for that, to get to the point of saying our standard was no plutonium. Right? What happens when George Bush becomes president, confronts eventually in 2002, confronts the North Koreans with our knowledge that they were cheating with the Pakistanis to produce an enrichment facility. He ends the agreed framework, and the North Koreans announce in January of 2003 that they are off to the races. They are going to separate plutonium, they're going to build nuclear weapons, and they're going to become a nuclear weapon state. out of the NPT. They do all that. Do you remember the war we fought? I don't, because we didn't. We watched it happen, right? We watched the reprocessing happen, and it's a sense in which we can actually watch the reprocessing happen. We watched nuclear weapons tests, and eventually we watched ballistic missile tests, and we knew they were aiming to make these. So I would say this has been a long time coming. We've tolerated a lot of this all along, and we could have been continuing, as we did through the Obama phase of strategic patience, containment, whatever you would like. We could have continued with that, but when Kim Jong-un in the New Year's message in January of this year said, we will be, it's words to the effect I'm not quoting now, we will be testing soon a ballistic missile of intercontinental range that will be able to put a nuclear weapon on U.S. soil. The president, to the best of my knowledge, there should be some international law against this, drew a red line with a tweet and said, I think this is a quote, not gonna happen. So we moved as we went along to the situation, and then the president said, that up with that we will not put.
It does seem, though, that with each recurring engagement effort, and there was later in the Bush administration one as well as the Obama administration, that it does seem that the standards that we try to hold North Korea to have also slipped along with the time.
Yes. Yes.
Well, let me address the matter that you raised in your talk, and which I alluded to in the introduction, and that is whether, in dealing with Kim Jong-un and his reign in North Korea, whether the U.S. and its allies are faced with a materially different situation than has been the case in these 2 decades running up to his reign. That is to say, is he the kind of rational actor who will indeed not be suicidal, who will settle for the kind of guaranteed future that you were laying out there without continuing to kind of press the aggressiveness. Is that your belief that you dealt with his father in the aftermath of the '94 agreement? Is he not materially different from his father, would you say?
I actually, I have to draw a line myself about how far I'm willing to go on something I know nothing about. And I, when we were talking beforehand, I made the uncomfortable point that I'm not a regional expert. I'm not, and I'm certainly not an expert on Korean affairs. So I know probably less than most people in this audience about Kim Jong-un. Yes, do I still read intelligence? Yes, but I'll tell you a secret. We don't know a lot about Kim Jong-un, I don't think. So it's the standard you have, you know, is this materially different than Kim Jong-il or Kim Il-sung, for that matter? Because when I first started negotiating, it was Kim Il-sung. I don't know, but my proposition is, as we used to say, a lower level one. It's less demanding than, you know, are his calculations rational and like his father's. The assertion I'm making here is that there's no evidence to believe that he is suicidal, that he is volatile, that he seems, if the stories are true, and I'm prepared to believe they are, he is brutal, and a bunch of other negative things. I'm prepared to believe that. But to put ourselves in the position we're in because we have up and decided that unlike Nikita Khrushchev, who I remind you took his shoe off at the United Nations down the street and pounded it on the podium when he spoke, just to make the point that he was volatile too. I mean, this is useful in deterrence theory, right? Because the less open you are to the rational calculation, you've just added a couple of battalions of missiles to your capability. So I don't know the answer to your question the way you framed it, but I will say until I learn otherwise that this is a country that can be deterred, is deterred, that not only deterred by our nuclear weapons, I'm not now arguing for first use, but I note to you that we do not have, to use two negatives, a no first use policy, and there's a reason for that. Maybe not a good enough one, but there is a reason for that. And part of it has to do with extended deterrence. But we certainly don't need that to deter North Korea from using those artillery pieces that are arrayed along the DMZ dug into caves. We have sufficient conventional capability to really, really ruin their whole day, and they know that.
Well, it does seem to me that there are fewer militating influences on Kim Jong-un, and that he has taken active steps to remove and eliminate some that did exist. So the reason why I think that bears on the question of can we essentially achieve a sort of status quo negotiation in return for guaranteed regime security is whether, because of his nature, because of the apparent fact that no one is in a position to tell him no, whether he will go beyond being simply willing to accept his place, his nuclear place in the region, or whether he is prone to keep pushing to use active nuclear blackmail on the surrounding countries, or even make some kind of gesture strike toward the United States. That's why I think the nature of his rule becomes part of the calculation. But as you say, neither of us knows, so we can't answer that. But let me, before we go to the audience question, just raise the strategic issue of Japan, since we're here at the Japan Society.
Please.
I believe it was 1998 when the first rocket, North Korean rocket, was fired over Japan. So this is not something new, although the nuclear character of it has certainly raised different considerations. But following that, and in fact following the Axis of Evil speech by George W. Bush, Koizumi, no dove himself, made a mission to North Korea where he tried to work out an entente with them and involving the abduction of Japanese citizens and the like. Is Japan also in a satisfactory position as you described the United States vis-a-vis North Korea strategically?
There may be a discount factor applied to me. I'm an American looking across the Pacific Ocean, and I believe that Tokyo, like Seoul, can depend upon the American extended deterrent with respect to North Korea or, in extremis, China. That is not because we are such wonderful, noble people, but because it is profoundly and deeply in our national security interest to have Japan successfully blackmailed, to use a word used just before, is completely unsatisfactory to America's strategic concept, traditionally, of the Asia-Pacific region and our place in it. We have been attempting to sustain that place in the face of, I would say, Chinese probes, and in an entirely different way, North Korean adventurism. It would and does serve us well to remind everyone of the Mutual Security Treaty with Japan and of our alliance with the ROK and our intent to sustain those agreements and live up to them. That's why I said, there's a little asterisk here, if we are in a world of containment, we must be particularly scrupulous about the cultivation and the maintenance of the alliances. And some of the language used by President-elect Trump and then President Trump about the alliances, regarding them, and I'm going to say this somewhat critically, without apology, as though they were a transactional deal, which we could change at our whim and renegotiate. That is unacceptable for successful deterrence.
In your talk, you noted the limitations of anti-missile defense with regard to ICBMs and such. Now, the THAAD, which is already deployed in the Republic of Korea and has been raised as a possibility to to safeguard in some fashion Japan. Are theater nuclear weapons any more subject to anti-missile defense that is sound and secure?
Yes, I would be a fan of a ballistic missile defense if it worked without leakage. So here's what limit of what I think I'm prepared to say on this. I think our layered defense against ballistic missiles in Northeast Asia, which is at the terminal end, Patriot missile, and in mid-course, both THAAD and the Aegis system, put these three separate systems together, and they offer a better and some measure of defense against MRBMs. Much better capability than the United States has been able to deploy against an ICBM threat to the homeland. I think if the North Koreans were kind enough to only fire one missile at us, tell us when they were going to do it, give us the details of the trajectory, we'd have a shot. Right? That's not an entirely realistic scenario. So as soon as the number of targets increases, and as I think you know, the reentry speeds change dramatically from IRBM to ICBM, our capacity to have any confidence in the ability to shoot down with a kinetic kill the incoming missile is very, and ought to be very low. Is that too contorted, or?
Well, I think you touched on part of the missile issue, and of course that brings in China, which is a whole other picture, and its objections to regional missile defense. But lest we get embroiled in that, let me invite some questions from the audience. Gentleman here, and the microphone will come to you. Please, 2 seats in, and I'll come to you in the back right afterwards. Please identify yourself.
Thank you. I'm Daniel Burke. I work with the Schiller Institute of Helga Zeppler-Roush. So reflecting on what you said here, it seems to me that the neocon policy towards North Korea, not only did it shut down the agreed framework, but it also prevented any real fulfillment of the Sunshine Policy. Like, for example, the construction of the Iron Silk Road, the 2 rail lines that would connect into the present-day One Belt, One Road of China. So here we are in 2017, and instead of cooperating on economic development, which would benefit all of Eurasia and build trust that we weren't going to attack North Korea, the US installed the THAAD system, and we pivoted our military to Asia, which is increasing tension with China just when we need to work with them on economic development. So my question is, where is the concept of win-win economic development in the solution space?
It's not hard to have a vision. It can be very hard to realize it, but I see it as plausible for the United States to enter, and let me say a word about the way you would do this, since just talking about the end game is too easy. How would you get there from where we are now, I think, is a better test. We need to have discussions with the North Koreans, call them negotiations, but I say discussions. Some have called it negotiations about negotiations, but we need to engage. I don't think it's adequate to engage at a mid-level or a junior level. I think it has to be a fairly designated person to do that. I think initially without preconditions, in other words, setting out our objectives and saying they have to meet our objectives before we start talking is not a guaranteed strategy to get negotiations going. So almost without preconditions, where you have, there's an ugly phrase in the arms control world, it's called unilateral understandings. That's internally inconsistent phrase, but a unilateral understanding is they haven't agreed to this, but this is what we understand. So we understand, and we want you to know we understand, that while we're having these meetings without preconditions, should you test a ballistic missile over Japan or detonate a nuclear explosive device, our non-conditioned discussions end. So that means don't do that. Now, they haven't agreed to that. They haven't adopted a moratorium, right? And we might also say, we understand that if while we're having these conversations, we do an aggressive version of a military exercise with the ROK, you'll walk out. Got it. So you do something like that. There are diplomatic ways of doing this without having an agreement. And you get to the point, I think, in these discussions where they can get larger, they can involve, somebody's going to want to know all of these six-party talks. Or initially, the United States and the DPRK. For those who went to the six-party talks, if you're here, then you could back me up when I didn't. I was out of government. But any real discussions take place bilaterally. So, and as the North Koreans have said to me when I asked what's your favorite modality, they say, we actually don't need to negotiate with Beijing. We need to negotiate with you. Got it. So what I'm saying to you is we could get in discussions to put stuff on the table which involves economic engagement as well. But I don't think, you shouldn't think that that's going to come and be the leader ahead of a political engagement. They are very much insistent that political engagement's coming first if there are going to be talks. And they want to come to the table. You've heard people say this. As a nuclear weapon state, as buff as we are, right? That is not actually going to happen, but that's okay. I think we still can have those discussions, and they can get to meet the North Korean objective of both having a capability and having economic development. They can get to what we want in an economic engagement. But some of what I laid out as their objectives, this political underbrush has got to be cleared away first. I don't think it's implausible beyond the minds of men and women to figure out how to do that.
I promise the gentleman on the aisle.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Irving Lee. My analysis of North Korea's nuclear weapons, I see it as a deterrent. As a deterrent from their perspective. But before I go there, I just want to point out that I think China's position on sanctions is a precursor to negotiations. I think negotiations is critical to resolving the problem. But with the installation of THAAD, which you pointed out, is a weak system if, let's say, China or Russia strikes first. So it makes more sense that it's more of a first strike system on our part. If we struck first, and they have a weakened response, that's the only way it works. It's a first strike system on our part. So THAAD is really much of a destabilization force aspect to negotiations. But before we go there, I wanted to point out that besides North Korea as being a deterrent, having nuclear weapons as a deterrent, it was a response to what happened in the Middle East. I think their withdrawal from the NPT was a consequence of our intervention in Iraq and subsequently Libya, which were countries that gave up their nuclear weapon systems, which basically their perspective is that we should have our nuclear deterrent because look what happened to Iraq and Libya.
Let me ask Professor Gallucci to respond to that. Who acted first?
So there's a lot in what you've said I want to react to. I think I told you that I had been on the receiving end of the North Korean claim that they were concerned about regime change because they had watched us change regimes in Iraq and in Libya. Now, the first time I heard that was in the early 90s in 1993, and we had done Iraq I, but not Iraq II. And what they said then was not that we got up one morning and decided to change the regime, pretty much what we did in the Bush administration, but that what impressed them was our capability, not our proclivity. I think, in other words, they understood that Iraq moved on Kuwait. And we had a fairly detailed exchange. Sidebar, it's not part of wasn't part of the negotiations. It was just one-on-one with interpreters. And what Counselor Chu said is that we watched you build forces. You build 500,000 men and women in the region before you jumped off. And they let you do that. We will not let you do that. We saw, I mean, what he was describing was an early version of shock and awe. We saw America's unique capability to project force almost anywhere with absolutely unique precision and lethality. We were not amused. This was not what we got after Gulf War II, Iraq II, where they were looking at our motivation and saying, you know, Iraq was what Iraq was in 2002, and then an invasion in 2003. This was a plan of the Bush administration. You can be a critic of it, as I am, or support it as prudent global management, which I do not buy. But there's a motivation there. And what you're getting from the North Koreans now, if I can make a distinction, is they've already made the point about our capability, but they're focusing on motivation, and they have lost all hope, excuse me, I think, of getting at our capability, but not our motivation. And they want to mess with that. So, I mean, I think your characterization of things, I don't accept quite the way they were laid out. But there is certainly truth, in my view, to the to the North Korean concern now. If we just frame the current situation, they are concerned about the U.S. capability and intention with respect to regime change in Pyongyang, and they are looking for a way to undercut that. There are at least two ways. One way is to have a nuclear weapons program which can survive a first strike and thus attack continental United States as a method of deterring credibly an attack on their regime, which would be catastrophic for them. And the other way is to develop a relationship that normalizes relations so that we would have no more intention to change the regime in Pyongyang than we do to change the one in Seoul. So, and what we need to do in a negotiation is move to the second solution rather than the first.
Yeah, I want to point out the Trump's speech in the United Nations, which basically said he denounces North Korea, but at the same time, he basically wanted to withdraw from the agreement with Iran. And Iran was willing to.
I noticed that, yeah.
Contradiction there. It just basically says, well, look, we're about to attack Iran by accelerating sanctions and withdrawing the agreement.
Let me just say here that it is not my view that the President's comments about the deal with Iran and his intentions about going forward with that deal, that is to say, not go forward with that deal, are helpful. I don't think they're in the national security interests of the United States with respect to Iran and our interests in the Middle East, and they certainly aren't helpful with respect to North Korea.
So we'll move on to a question on this side of the room. Lady right 3 rows back, microphone coming.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. My name is Michael Takeuchi, United Nations. I'm working on the DPRK sanction. My question is, so what do you think is the main factor that makes the current sanction, not working well? Is it North Koreans' economic and social tolerance and strong will, or are the shortcoming of the neighboring countries' implementation of the sanction? And either way, what's your suggestion? Like, how makes the sanction regime more workable?
So, I'm not an expert on sanctions, and Washington is filled with, among other things, experts on sanctions. And what I think I understand is that, one, North Korea is different from Iran in terms of its vulnerability to international sanctions. It is less integrated into an international economy. And it does a lot of what it does to get the hard currency it wants and to get other goods that sustain the regime are accomplished through bilateral relations with countries who don't always or scrupulously abide by the terms of sanctions. That said, I think the North Koreans have even admitted, and I think it is true, that sanctions hurt the DPRK. What I was saying in my remarks, and I think is true, that to say sanctions hurt does not mean that it makes it a good policy because either A, it will stop their ballistic missiles or nuclear weapons program, which I do not believe to be true and is not directly accessible through sanctions, I don't think, anymore in a material way, or B, be so catastrophic in economic terms as to threaten the stability of the regime, leading the regime to seek negotiations from a weakened position. That seems implausible to me, and all of this partly because I believe the Chinese are, to use a Psychology 101 phrase, conflicted. I do not think the Chinese wish to see American military and naval forces on their borders. They're not looking for a conflict in Northeast Asia. But they also don't wish to see the collapse of that regime. They are not looking for a reunified peninsula under a government in Seoul, right, allied with the United States of America, and the absence of a buffer state, which is what, in crude terms, North Korea is for China. So I think partially because of vulnerability, partially because of the will and the ability of the North Korean people to accept suffering and pain, and the government's commitment to this capability, that our policy will not sustain. I will say one other point that a lot of people have, I think, a lot of people have looked at sanctions as important to the Iran deal, because they were. That did not lead Iran to give up its centrifuge capability. And for those of you who follow Asia and not the Middle East, that centrifuge capability is still there, and it will come back. And they suffered lots of sanctions that were very painful for Iran, and the government actually ran in an election on getting sanctions removed. They were so painful. But still, as a matter of national pride, they were very, very clear. We're not giving up the centrifuge program, and they haven't.
Which the neocons frequently point out.
Mm-hmm. It's accurate.
But on the matter of sanctions, before we move to the next question, the measurable North Korean exports, especially to China, have dramatically increased over the last decade. So that, again, if Kim Jong-un is a rational actor and is interested in the building up the economic capability of his state as one of his primary objectives, this ought to have a bearing.
Yeah, the only reason I'm not nodding enthusiastically is because I don't want to then find myself saying that since he's an irrational character, and your whole argument about deterrence falls apart. I'll pass on that.
All right. A skilled negotiator doesn't want to fall into a trap. Gentleman on the aisle here.
My name is Henry DeVeem. Is the military in control of Kim Jong-un, or is it the other way round?
Remember what I said about my expertise on this point. A, I don't know. B, I believe that there are bureaucratic or power centers like the party, like the military, and even a technological elite. And Kang Seok-ju was actually more open to explaining the technological pressures, because we talked about whether he should get a light water reactor and how that related to gas graphite reactors, et cetera. So I know that leaders, whether it be Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il, need to keep powerful people in their government on their side. But they're also, and he particularly clearly, is capable of picking some of them off and dispatching them. So I think he needs them, and they are responsive to him, I think, for as long as he is delivering. And I think that's part of what this is about. This is a little bit of history I'm relying on and some instinct, but I wouldn't say I have real insight into the way decisions are made in Pyongyang.
Another question here in the middle, second row, and then, gentlemen, I'll come to you next. We have about, I believe, about 5 minutes, so 2 quick questions.
Thank you. Ariana King with Nikkei and the Nikkei Asian Review. I'm going to do 2 very quickly, if you don't mind. So first, you've spoken a lot about bilateral negotiations and even mentioned that perhaps Beijing doesn't need to be there. But I'm wondering if you see any role for the UN, given Secretary General Guterres has offered his good offices in mediation. And I'm sure you've heard the news that the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons has been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize today for their work in the nuclear ban treaty negotiations. I'm wondering, do you see this nuclear ban treaty doing anything in the situation, adding anything to the mix? Thank you.
With respect to the UN, right now, I don't understand or know that there are the kinds of discussions taking place that I think need to take place if negotiations are going to be part of the solution to the current situation. So if the United Nations offer were to create a venue or a possibility for discussions, I would be enthusiastic about it. I note to you, though, that once before, Vice Foreign Minister Kang Suk-ju took it upon himself to educate me and to make sure I understood that when I talked about the UN, they regarded the UN as the belligerent in the Korean War and not this international organization that, you know, brings people together. And he then added that the Korean War had not ended and that the UN remained a belligerent. So that's a certain historical perspective that is not unimportant in Pyongyang. So that might present a little problem to the UN providing the, quote, neutral venue. With respect to the idea that, if I understood the second part of the question, that a group that makes an impassioned and rational argument for the abolition of nuclear weapons might bear upon the North Korean calculation. I think over the long term, much like I regard the NPT, it's extremely important to what I will loosely call the norm against nuclear weapons. But right now, I don't think there's a sharp enough point on the end of that norm to impact the calculation in Pyongyang. So I wouldn't expect a direct impact of this award, richly deserved reward for a group committed to the abolition of nuclear weapons.
We're into overtime, but I promised this gentleman toward the front opportunity with a quick question.
My name is Jad Zaytouni. I just wanted to ask, you talked a lot about what is the correct policy response of the United States, what it should be. But given the current response of escalating rhetoric and brinksmanship, what is the likelihood that things might fall out of hand, either by US provocation or North Korean provocation?
So, a couple of points I can make about this. One is that I'm a pretty close watcher of the U.S. national security bureaucracy, and I was in it for over 20 years. And I have never seen, in my experience, or I would say even in my reading about the national security bureaucracy before, when I was a graduate student and studied this, I haven't seen a process like, if that's even a correct word, a process like the one we now have, or a method of relating to our allies or potential enemies, the international community. So I actually don't know the way things happen now. I do have a sense that obviously the president is an important actor determining what the United States does. I think he is influenced at least on occasion, by the people he has surrounded himself with, and I certainly think that includes the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and National Security Advisor, and perhaps also as Chief of Staff. There are a lot of military people in that collection. So I do think there's some amount of rationality and control when you, how exactly these people come together, I don't know, because I don't know this process. But I think you should expect that there would be a measured response by the United States to this kind of a situation. But the second point about miscalculation and the escalating war of words is, of course, troubling. I wouldn't say it isn't. Nothing in my prepared remarks is to indicate that we cannot end up exactly where everybody says they don't want to be. Do you know anybody that says, I want to go to war? Even the President of the United States will be a reluctant belligerent, and presumably, even with the language used by the North Koreans, given the balance of forces, will be a reluctant belligerent. So nobody wants this, but is this a dangerous time? Don't misconstrue what I said. Yes, I think it is a dangerous time. Is miscalculation possible? Might the North Koreans, I mean, I told you what I thought about deterrence. That's maybe interesting to you, but much more important is what the North Koreans think about deterrence. Do they think if they splash down some IRBMs around Guam, it'll be okay? Maybe they weren't listening to Secretary Mattis. I was. I don't think it would be okay. I don't think we would suck it up. You know, is what kind of threat it is, we could talk about that. What I'm saying here is I wanted to present a different characterization of the current situation, but it is still a dangerous one, and by the word you used, it could become catastrophic, and that word is miscalculation.
So if it's not a crisis yet, it could well become one.
Absolutely.
In real terms. Well, thank you, Ambassador Gallucci. Please join me in expressing our appreciation.